Hey guys, tonight we begin with a man who was called a military genius, a tyrant, a reformer, a destroyer, and by some enemies, simply very annoying. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe place your phone somewhere it can slowly slide off the bed later, and let your thoughts drift back to Europe, a continent full of kings, powdered wigs, fragile egos, and borders that changed more often than fashion trends. Tonight, we begin with Napoleon Bonaparte, a man not especially tall in the popular imagination, though history has been rude to him there. A Corsican outsider who arrived in France, climbed through revolution, crowned himself emperor because waiting for permission seemed inefficient, and reshaped Europe through ambition, brilliance, and relentless confidence. And then, because history loves sequels no one asked for, we will slowly trace how the world Napoleon helped create would stumble, crack, and eventually slide toward World War II. So let's begin where many troublesome men begin, with childhood. Napoleon was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, just after France acquired it, meaning he entered the world already living through political transition. Very on brand. His family was minor nobility, not rich enough to relax, not poor enough to disappear. The uncomfortable middle zone where ambition thrives. Young Napoleon spoke Corsican and Italian before proper French. When he was sent to military school in mainland France, classmates mocked his accent, manners, and provincial background. Children, as always, remained committed to being terrible. He responded in a classic way. He withdrew. He read obsessively. He developed pride the size of a cathedral. And he remembered insults forever. A useful trait if your future hobby is conquering Europe. At military school, he studied artillery. This mattered. Artillery required mathematics, discipline, logistics, timing. It rewarded competence more than family name. In old aristocratic armies, noble birth often mattered more than skill. Cannonballs, however, are famously class-blind. Napoleon learned quickly. He also learned impatience. He disliked fools, delays, ceremony, and being told no. Unfortunately for everyone else, he would soon gain power before learning humility, a timeless management problem. Now, let's float gently into the French Revolution. France in the late 18th century was burdened by debt, inequality, hunger, and leadership that could politely be described as struggling. King Louis XVI was not a monster so much as a man mismatched to catastrophe. Revolution exploded. Old structures collapsed. Titles became dangerous accessories. Heads rolled with unsettling efficiency. And in the chaos, careers opened for talented officers who were not born into privilege. Napoleon noticed. Of course he did. In 1793, at the Siege of Toulon, royalists backed by the British held a key port. Napoleon proposed artillery placements that helped retake the city. It worked brilliantly. Suddenly, he was promoted. This became a pattern. Crisis appears. Napoleon enters. Explains what everyone else is doing wrong. Wins. Gets promoted. Collective resentment follows. Soon after came one of the more famous moments. In Paris, a royalist uprising threatened the revolutionary government. Napoleon responded with artillery, loaded with grapeshot, a brutal anti-personnel blast. It crushed the revolt. Thousands understood immediately that politics had entered a new phase. The government understood something else. This compact Corsican officer was useful, very useful. Now enters romance, because history insists. Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, elegant, socially connected, charming, financially chaotic. She was older than him, sophisticated, and not nearly as obsessed with him as he was with her. He wrote passionate letters. Many. Too many. Letters of such intensity that modern readers may feel the need to set them down and hydrate. Josephine often replied with considerably less urgency, a dynamic recognizable across centuries. Still, they married in 1796. 2 days later, Napoleon left to command the army of Italy. Nothing says romance like immediate military deployment.
The Italian campaign transformed him into legend. French armies were hungry, underpaid, disorganized. Their shoes had opinions. Supplies were scarce. Napoleon arrived and told them they were about to win glory and wealth. Then he maneuvered faster than enemy commanders expected, split opposing armies, struck repeatedly, and turned weakness into momentum. He understood speed. He understood morale. He understood that confused enemies make excellent targets. Within a year, he defeated Austrian forces and redrew the political map of Italy. Europe blinked. Who is this man? France answered, our new favorite problem. He returned a hero. Newspapers praised him. Artists painted him dramatically. Politicians feared him. Quite sensible of them, because military fame plus political instability often equals future trouble. Napoleon then embarked on the Egyptian campaign, officially to strike British interests, unofficially to build glory somewhere sunny. He won battles, lost fleets, brought scholars, admired antiquity, and got stranded after Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. A mixed trip. Still, Napoleon managed the ancient art of leaving before consequences fully matured. He returned to France. France by 1799 was tired. Revolution had produced ideals, bloodshed, inflation, factional drama, and governments with the shelf life of dairy. Napoleon arrived as the answer to exhaustion. He helped stage the coup of 18 Brumaire. Yes, the revolution had invented a new calendar too, because normal chaos was apparently insufficient. The coup overthrew the Directory. Napoleon became first consul, which sounded temporary. It was not. Now begins the central question. Was he genius or dictator? Let's annoy everyone by saying both. As ruler, Napoleon stabilized finances, created the Bank of France, improved administration, built roads, reconciled with the church through the Concordat, and established the Napoleonic Code. The code spread ideas of legal equality for men, property rights, secular law, merit-based advancement. It also restricted women's rights sharply. Progress arrived carrying baggage, as usual. He rewarded talent. He centralized power. He prized efficiency. He censored critics. He loved order, especially when he was giving it. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame Cathedral. The Pope was present, mostly as decoration. Napoleon took the crown and placed it on his own head, a symbolic statement, roughly translated as, I trust myself with this task. Then he crowned Josephine. Europe's monarchs watched in horror, and perhaps a little envy. War resumed. Coalitions formed against France repeatedly. Britain financed resistance. Austria, Prussia, Russia entered and exited alliances with the regularity of confused dancers. Napoleon defeated them one by one. At the Battle of Austerlitz, he produced one of history's classic victories, luring enemies into weakness and smashing them. At Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, he shattered Prussia. At treaties of Tilsit, he met Tsar Alexander I of Russia on a raft in the river like two men launching a luxury podcast. Napoleon seemed unstoppable. Europe was reorganized. Kingdoms created, relatives placed on thrones, brothers promoted beyond competence. The classic family business model. Yet empire creates resistance. Nationalism grew in Spain, Germany, Italy, elsewhere. Occupation rarely wins popularity contests. Then came the Peninsular War in Spain. Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Spain objected. Britain under Arthur Wellesley joined the fight. Guerrilla warfare drained French forces year after year. Napoleon called it his Spanish ulcer, an unusually accurate diagnosis. Meanwhile, Josephine could not provide an heir.
Napoleon divorced her, sadly but practically, then married Marie Louise of Austria. Love had become diplomacy wearing formal clothes. A son was born. Napoleon rejoiced. Europe remained unconvinced. Then came the Great Error, Russia. In 1812, Napoleon invaded with the Grande Armée, one of the largest forces Europe had seen. Hundreds of thousands marched east. The Russians retreated, burning supplies, refusing decisive battle until Battle of Borodino, then yielding Moscow. Napoleon entered the city. It burned. The Tsar did not surrender. Winter approached. Every bad decision began introducing itself. We'll continue in part 2 with the retreat from Russia, Napoleon's fall, exile, return, Waterloo, and how the Europe he transformed helped create the tensions that eventually led to World War II.
Europe noticed. Now begins the coalition phase. When a dominant figure stumbles, rivals rediscover courage with suspicious speed. Prussia rose again. Austria reconsidered its relationship with Napoleon. Russia advanced westward. Britain continued funding resistance because Britain never met an anti-Napoleon coalition it didn't enjoy financing. In 1813 came the Battle of Leipzig, also called the Battle of Nations. Napoleon fought skillfully, but faced overwhelming numbers. He lost. It was one of those defeats so large that geography itself seems involved. France was invaded. Allies advanced toward Paris. Napoleon, still energetic, still brilliant in flashes, still unable to understand the phrase "enough now," fought a sharp defensive campaign in 1814, but could not reverse reality. He abdicated. The Emperor of Europe was sent to Elba, a small island off Italy, given sovereignty over it because apparently the continent believed he needed a hobby. Now, imagine being Napoleon on Elba, used to commanding armies, now inspecting roads, gardens, administration, local mines. He threw himself into governing the island with impressive seriousness, because of course he did. But he watched France, and France watched the restored Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII, who had the difficult task of returning to a country transformed by revolution and empire. Many French citizens found the restoration uninspiring. Some missed stability, some missed glory, some missed promotions. Some simply disliked being told to forget 25 years of upheaval. Napoleon noticed this too, naturally. So in 1815, he escaped Elba. One sentence, enormous consequences. He landed in France with a tiny force. Troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. Legend can be very persuasive when uniforms are undecided. As he marched toward Paris, support grew. Louis XVIII fled. Napoleon resumed power in what became known as the 100 Days. Europe responded in the traditional manner, with armies. This brings us to Battle of Waterloo. Near present-day Belgium, Napoleon faced forces under Arthur Wellesley and the approaching Prussians under Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher. The ground was muddy. Timing mattered. Communication mattered. Luck mattered. Fatigue mattered. In other words, history's usual ingredients. Napoleon attacked. Wellington held. The Prussians arrived. French chances evaporated in stages, then collapsed. Waterloo ended the Napoleonic era. A single battle can be overrated by storytellers, but this one genuinely mattered. Napoleon abdicated again. This time, the Allies chose a more secure exile, St. Helena. Remote, windswept, very difficult to dramatically escape from. Thoughtful planning at last. On St. Helena, Napoleon dictated memoirs, argued about treatment, cultivated legend, and revised the past in his favor with tireless commitment. He died there in 1821. Still famous, still divisive, still explaining himself. So, genius or dictator? Let's be inconvenient again. He was a military genius. He was also authoritarian. He modernized law and administration. He censored dissent. He opened careers to talent.
He pursued endless war. He spread revolutionary principles. He crowned himself emperor. He embodied meritocracy and vanity in one compact package. History loves contradictions. Napoleon practically industrialized them. Now, let's float gently toward the long shadow. How does Napoleon connect to World War II? Not directly. He did not cause it from beyond the grave like an especially strategic ghost, but he reshaped Europe in ways that mattered deeply. First, nationalism. Napoleon conquered territories and reorganized states. In response, peoples across Europe developed stronger national identities. Germans asked what Germany should be. Italians asked what Italy should be. Spaniards fought occupation fiercely. Resistance created identity. Identity later sought states. States later sought power. Power later sought trouble. Second, the destruction of old feudal structures. Napoleonic reforms weakened aristocratic privilege and spread modern bureaucracy. Efficient states collect taxes better, raise armies better, and manage war better. Useful progress. Also dangerous in the wrong hands.
Third, the map problem. After Napoleon's defeat, Europe's leaders met at the Congress of Vienna to restore balance. They wanted stability. They also wanted to suppress revolution. They redrew borders, restored monarchies, and tried to freeze politics. History rarely respects freezing attempts. Nationalist and liberal movements kept growing through the 19th century. Revolutions in 1848 shook Europe. Then came the unifications of Germany and Italy, especially Germany. This is important because before Napoleon, the German lands were a patchwork under the old Holy Roman Empire, which Napoleon effectively swept away. After decades of change, Otto von Bismarck unified Germany in 1871 after wars with Denmark, Austria, and France. A strong, united Germany emerged in Central Europe. France was humiliated. Europe's balance changed dramatically, and the future began clearing its throat. Then came imperial rivalries, alliance systems, arms races, industrial competition, and enough mutual suspicion to power a continent, all of which helped produce World War I. That war devastated Europe, toppled empires, radicalized politics, and produced the harsh Treaty of Versailles. Germany felt humiliated. Economic crisis followed. Extremism grew. And eventually Adolf Hitler rose to power, promising revenge, restoration, and expansion. Always beware leaders selling wounded pride in dramatic packaging. So the road to World War II was long. Napoleon did not build the road alone, but he helped redesign the landscape. He accelerated nationalism, state modernization, military mobilization, and the end of old Europe. He was one of the giant turning points that made later conflicts possible in new forms. And perhaps that is his final legacy. Not merely battles won or crowns worn, but a continent permanently changed by one man's talent, ambition, and inability to sit still. If you ask whether Napoleon was genius or dictator, the sleepy answer is yes. He was brilliance without restraint, order imposed by force, modernity carried by cannon, and Europe spent the next century and more dealing with the consequences. All right, settle in again. Napoleon Bonaparte is now on St. Helena, dictating memoirs and re-editing history in his own favor, which many former rulers would absolutely do if given time and stationery. Meanwhile, Europe has a question. Now what? A fair question. Because after 20-plus years of revolution and near-constant war, the continent was exhausted, economies damaged, borders rearranged, dynasties shaken, cemeteries busier than usual. So the victorious powers gathered in Vienna for the Congress of Vienna. This was part peace conference, part map workshop, part elite social season. There were banquets, balls, endless negotiations, private deals, and enough formal clothing to strain textile production. Europe was rebuilding itself in style. The leading figures included Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian master of conservative order, Robert Stewart, Viscount Castlereagh,
representing British interests. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, spiritual one week and imperial the next, and many others determined to prevent another Napoleon-shaped inconvenience. Their goal was balance, not democracy, not equality, not asking common people what they wanted. Balance, which in diplomatic language often means powerful states feel safe enough not to invade each other immediately. They restored old dynasties where possible. They strengthened buffer states around France. They shifted territories like pieces on a board. And for a while, it worked. No continent-wide war like the Napoleonic struggle erupted for decades. This was no small achievement. Yet beneath the calm surface, several problems were politely shoved under expensive carpets.
Napoleon smashed that structure. After him came the German Confederation, a loose collection of states, including Prussia and Austria. Loose collections can persist. They can also annoy ambitious administrators. Prussia began modernizing efficiently. Army reforms, bureaucracy, education, railways later on. Very practical, very disciplined, slightly ominous in hindsight. In Italy, the peninsula remained divided into kingdoms, duchies, papal territories, and foreign-controlled zones. But the idea of Italy slowly strengthened. Poets wrote, conspirators whispered, secret societies met dramatically. Young patriots dreamed of unity, while probably wearing excellent coats. Then came the revolutions of 1848, a continent-wide burst of revolt. France overthrew Louis Philippe. German liberals demanded constitutions and national unity. Hungarians challenged Habsburg rule. Italian states revolted. Workers protested hardship. Students gave speeches at dangerous volume. For a moment, it looked as if old Europe might truly transform. Then many revolutions failed. Armies reasserted control. Coalitions fractured. Moderates feared radicals. Radicals distrusted moderates. The classic reform collapse package. Yet failure was not complete. Ideas survived. Constitutions lingered in places. Rulers learned they could not ignore public pressure forever. Nationalism remained alive. And nationalism, unlike some governments, can wait patiently. Meanwhile, outside Europe, the United Kingdom expanded global trade and empire. Industrial might surged. Steamships and railways shrank distance. Telegraph lines accelerated communication. The world was becoming faster. Faster trade, faster news, faster mobilization, faster mistakes. Across the Atlantic, the United States was expanding westward, fighting internal conflicts over slavery, territory, and political identity. This matters later because the American Civil War would demonstrate modern mass warfare, rail logistics, trenches, and industrial killing on a huge scale. Europe watched. Some learned lessons. Not all learned the right ones. Back in Europe, one state stood poised for outsized influence: Prussia. It had military tradition, growing industry, and leaders who increasingly believed German unity should happen under Prussian leadership, preferably with Prussia in charge of the important seats. And eventually, one of the most formidable political operators of the century arrived: Otto von Bismarck. Tall, clever, ruthless, dryly funny, and fully willing to use war as a negotiation tool. Never ideal, often effective. But before Bismarck fully enters, pause and notice the larger pattern. Napoleon had broken old structures. Vienna restored order. Industrialization destabilized society. Nationalism energized populations. Revolutions tested regimes. Modern states grew stronger. Europe looked peaceful at intervals,
But the machinery of larger future wars was quietly being assembled. Rail lines, mass literacy, tax systems, conscription models, steel production, explosive chemistry, centralized bureaucracy, all the ingredients of progress, and regrettably, catastrophe. By the mid-19th century, people still remembered Napoleon. Some admired him as genius, some cursed him as destroyer. Many politicians feared another charismatic military ruler. Reasonable concern. History occasionally repeats, though usually with worse mustaches.
Soon, Bismarck would reshape Germany through calculated wars. France would seek revenge, Austria would decline, Russia would brood, Britain would balance offshore, empires would compete globally, and Europe would move closer to the chain of events leading first to World War I, and then through its wreckage to World War II. All in due time. Slowly. Inevitably. With paperwork first. All right, get comfortable again. We left Europe in that familiar 19th century condition. Elegant buildings, anxious rulers, growing factories, restless populations, and enough unresolved nationalism to keep future historians fully employed. Now enters Otto von Bismarck. If Napoleon Bonaparte was dramatic lightning, Bismarck was controlled machinery. Less theatrical flourish, more cold leverage. Less battlefield pose, more document signed while someone else panics. He was a Prussian aristocrat, conservative by instinct, sharp-minded, deeply pragmatic, and willing to use ideology the way other people use umbrellas, only when useful. A dangerous talent. Bismarck became minister-president of Prussia in 1862. Prussia's parliament resisted military spending. Liberals wanted constitutional limits. The king wanted reform and authority. So naturally, everyone was annoyed. Bismarck addressed Parliament and delivered one of the century's most famous lines. The great questions of the time would be decided not by speeches and majority decisions, but by blood and iron. Subtlety had left the room. Now, to be fair, Bismarck was not calling for endless war for fun. He believed power realities shaped history more than speeches did, and unfortunately, he was often correct. He also understood timing. He did not rush blindly into conflict. He prepared. He isolated enemies diplomatically. Then he struck when odds favored Prussia. A very efficient style, unpleasant to face. First came war with Denmark in 1864 over Schleswig and Holstein. The details are complicated, emotional, legalistic, and exactly the kind of territory
dispute diplomats pretend to understand. Prussia and Austria defeated Denmark together. Victory created shared administration. Shared administration created friction. Bismarck noticed opportunity immediately. Of course he did. Next came war with Austria in 1866. Short, sharp, decisive. At the Battle of Königsgrätz, Prussia's modern army, rail coordination, and needle guns helped defeat Austria. Many older European powers suddenly discovered they were using yesterday's methods. An uncomfortable realization. Austria was pushed out of German affairs. Prussia now dominated northern Germany. And Bismarck, importantly, did not humiliate Austria excessively. This mattered. He wanted Austria weakened, not permanently vengeful. A rare moment of restraint in continental politics. Then came the final step, France. Under Napoleon III, nephew of the original Napoleon,
France still expected prestige and influence. Napoleon III had charm, ambition, and a habit of overestimating outcomes. A family trait, perhaps. France worried about rising Prussian power. Bismarck understood that a war against France could unite the southern German states behind Prussia. So he waited for the right diplomatic spark. It arrived through the Ems dispatch. Bismarck edited a telegram to make a royal exchange sound more insulting than it had been. France reacted angrily. Public opinion flared. War followed. Sometimes world-changing events begin with selective wording, a lesson that has aged disturbingly well. The Franco-Prussian War was disastrous for France. German forces moved efficiently. French planning did not. At Battle of Sedan, Napoleon III was captured, which is generally considered a poor day for an emperor. Paris was besieged. France suffered humiliation. And in January 1871, inside the Hall of Mirrors at Palace of Versailles, the German Empire was proclaimed. A united Germany had arrived. In France, at Versailles. This was not tactful. It was, however, symbolic in the most provocative way possible. Future resentment was already taking notes.
Yet beneath the stability, structural problems remained. Austria-Hungary was multi-ethnic and fragile. Russia was vast, autocratic, and uneasy. France wanted recovery. Britain guarded naval supremacy and empire. Germany's power kept rising. Nationalism spread in the Balkans. Colonial competition expanded overseas. Industrial capacity meant future wars would be larger, faster, deadlier. The machine kept improving. The users did not necessarily. Then came a turning point. In 1888, Wilhelm II became Kaiser. Young, energetic, insecure, theatrical, fond of uniforms, eager for personal rule. Not an ideal combination. He soon dismissed Bismarck in 1890. Imagine firing the continent's most skilled political mechanic because you disliked being advised, then driving faster. That was roughly the move. With Bismarck gone, Germany's foreign policy grew less careful. Relations with Russia deteriorated. Naval rivalry with Britain increased. Colonial swagger expanded. Statements became louder. Subtlety packed its bags. And the alliance balance that had preserved relative peace began to weaken. This is where the road bends toward World War I. Not immediately. There would still be years of diplomacy, trade, optimism, art, inventions, and people confidently assuming civilization had matured beyond major war. A classic pre-disaster hobby. But the foundations were changing. Germany unified by force. France resentful. Austria anxious. Russia mobilizing slowly. Britain suspicious. Empires competing worldwide. Balkans unstable. Weapons modernizing. Rail timetables waiting like loaded springs.
And all of it, in some distant sense, still connected to the Europe Napoleon had shattered and transformed. Old structures broken, new powers born, national ambitions awakened, modern states hardened. The 19th century looked elegant in portraits. Underneath, gears were grinding. All right, settle in once more. We now arrive in the late 19th century and early 20th century. That curious era when Europe looked polished, wealthy, cultured, and completely convinced it had mastered civilization. Cities glowed with electric lights.
Trains ran on schedules. Opera houses were full. Scientific discoveries multiplied. Coffee houses buzzed with ideas. And governments quietly prepared for industrial slaughter on a scale no one fully grasped. A very human contradiction. This period is often remembered as the Belle Époque in parts of Europe, the beautiful age. Beautiful if you had money. Less beautiful if you worked 12 hours in a factory, mined coal, or lived under colonial rule. Still, for elites especially, it felt like progress had no ceiling. There were telephones, automobiles, department stores, photography, luxury liners, and enough optimism to wallpaper several empires. But beneath the silk gloves sat clenched fists.
Let's start with Germany. Unified in 1871, rich in coal and steel, educated, organized, and expanding rapidly, Germany became an industrial powerhouse. Its chemistry industry led the world. Its universities attracted scholars. Its army inspired both admiration and concern. Its leaders increasingly wanted what they called a place in the sun, meaning colonies, prestige, and recognition, meaning everyone else should make room. Under Wilhelm II, Germany pursued a more assertive foreign policy. The Kaiser loved uniforms, speeches, ships, ceremony, and saying things that diplomats then had to explain. He also wanted a great navy. This mattered because Britain already had one, and Britain did not enjoy competition at sea. So began the Anglo-German naval arms race. Germany built battleships. Britain built more. Germany responded. Britain responded harder. Shipyards thrived. Taxpayers sighed. Admirals smiled in that specific way admirals do when budgets increase. The United Kingdom relied on naval supremacy for empire, trade, and security. Any challenger felt threatening, especially one located across the North Sea with excellent engineers. Now to France. France had recovered economically and politically after the Franco-Prussian humiliation, but memory of losing Alsace-Lorraine remained powerful. The Third Republic stabilized slowly. There were scandals, ideological battles, anti-clerical disputes, and the famous Dreyfus Affair, which revealed deep divisions over justice, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. A healthy reminder that modern societies can be advanced and irrational simultaneously. France wanted security, preferably with allies, preferably against Germany. Very understandable. Then there was Russia. Huge, autocratic, resource-rich, administratively clumsy, industrializing unevenly. The Romanov Empire stretched across continents, containing many peoples and many grievances. Tsar Nicholas II was personally decent by some accounts, devoted to family, and spectacularly unsuited to the demands of modern rule, a recurring dynastic issue. Russia sought influence in the Balkans and access to warm water routes. It also viewed itself as protector of Slavic peoples, which was morally flattering and strategically convenient. Now to Austria-Hungary. This empire was elegant on postcards and complicated in practice. Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Italians, Poles, Ukrainians, and others all lived within it. Many wanted autonomy. Some wanted independence. Some wanted other people to stop wanting independence. Managing this required diplomacy, compromise, bureaucracy, and luck. Luck was in short supply. Meanwhile,
The Balkans became Europe's nervous corner. The declining Ottoman Empire lost control of territories. New states emerged. Borders were disputed. Nationalism burned brightly. Great powers meddled constantly. It was called the powder keg of Europe because subtle metaphors had given up. Now let's discuss alliances. States fearing isolation began clustering together. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy formed the Triple Alliance. France and Russia formed an alliance. Britain, after years of splendid isolation, moved closer to France and Russia, creating the Triple Entente. So Europe developed two armed camps. Flexible diplomacy narrowed. Suspicion widened. And everyone claimed the alliances preserved peace. Which they did. Until they didn't.
At the same time, military planning became increasingly rigid. Germany developed the Schlieffen Plan, envisioning a rapid strike through Belgium to defeat France before Russia fully mobilized. Russia had mobilization schedules. France had offensive plans. Railroads were mapped to the minute. Millions of men could be moved quickly. Once begun, stopping such systems became very hard. The trains, unlike politicians, often ran on time. And while generals prepared future war, ordinary life continued. People married, children played, artists painted. Workers organized unions, tourists visited seaside resorts. Newspapers debated scandals, inventors amazed the public. Many believed war among civilized powers was too irrational to happen. Commerce was too global, culture too refined, science too advanced. A touching faith. Yet crises kept occurring. The First Moroccan Crisis, the Second Moroccan Crisis, the Bosnian Crisis, the Balkan Wars. Each one raised tensions. Each one ended without continental war. And every peaceful resolution taught leaders a dangerous lesson. Maybe the next crisis would also somehow resolve itself. This is how people learn the wrong thing from luck. Now, notice something deeper. Industrial society had created capacities previous generations lacked. Mass-produced rifles, machine guns, heavy artillery, rail mobilization, telegraphs, large reserves of trained conscripts, chemical industries, modern finance, national propaganda networks. If war came, it would not resemble the neat campaigns imagined in uniforms and maps. But many leaders still thought in older terms. Short wars, quick victories, heroic offensives, flags and capitals. They were planning the future using outdated fantasies. Never ideal. Then came the summer of 1914, and one assassination in a tense region would activate alliances, mobilization plans, pride, fear, deadlines, and bad judgment all at once. The system had become efficient at one thing: escalation. We'll continue in Part 6 with the shot in Sarajevo, the chain reaction into World War I, and how that war's wreckage opened the road to World War II. All right, get comfortable again. We now arrive at one of history's most famous examples of how a small event can collide with a giant, unstable system. It is June 1914. Europe is wealthy, armed, nervous, proud, interconnected, and strangely confident that catastrophe can be managed by serious men in decorated uniforms. A recurring mistake. In the city of Sarajevo, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand prepared for an official visit. He was not universally adored. Within the empire, opinions varied. Among Serbian nationalists and South Slav radicals,
he represented imperial rule, which tends not to win local popularity contests. Now, Franz Ferdinand himself was more complicated than cartoon villain versions suggest. He could be stubborn, blunt, aristocratic, and not exactly warm. But he also favored reforms that might have given Slavic peoples greater status inside the empire. History occasionally removes imperfect people at moments when moderation might have mattered. A cruel habit.
He traveled with his wife, Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, whom he deeply loved. This mattered because court protocol often treated her as socially inferior. Their marriage had rank complications, because aristocracy can make romance exhausting. In Sarajevo, however, she could appear beside him officially, a rare public happiness. Not ideal timing. A group of conspirators linked to Serbian nationalist networks planned assassination. Young men with pistols, bombs, romantic ideas, and poor foresight, as youth movements sometimes do. The motorcade route was published. Security was lax, another recurring mistake. First attempt, a bomb was thrown. It missed the Archduke's car and injured others. Already a dramatic enough morning for most people. Yet officials continued the visit, because apparently changing plans was considered gauche. Franz Ferdinand went to see the wounded at the hospital. The drivers became confused about the route. Cars stopped near a cafe. And there, by absurd chance mixed with negligence, stood Gavrilo Princip. He fired. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were mortally wounded. 2 shots, then silence, then consequences. Now, assassinations had happened before. Europe had survived many crises. But this one struck an empire already anxious about nationalism and decline. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia. Germany offered support, the famous blank check, meaning we back you. Strong wording, risky timing. Austria-Hungary issued a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia accepted much of it, but not all. Enough for compromise, perhaps? Not enough for those wanting confrontation.
Then sudden bombardment. Then whistles. Then climbing ladders into gunfire. A poor system overall. Elsewhere, fronts opened in the East, Balkans, Middle East, Africa, and at sea. Empires dragged colonies into war. Millions who had no quarrel with Sarajevo found themselves fighting because empires had schedules. India sent troops. African carriers labored under brutal conditions. Australians and New Zealanders fought at Gallipoli. Canadians, South Africans, Arabs, and many others were drawn in. Globalization had arrived, not in its best form. Then came the great meat grinder battles. Battle of Verdun. Months of slaughter. France vowed they shall not pass. Many did not. Battle of the Somme. On the first day, the British Army suffered catastrophic losses. Entire communities felt the blow, because local regiments often recruited neighbors together. A village could lose its young men by afternoon. Technology advanced during the war. Tanks appeared awkwardly. Aircraft evolved from reconnaissance to combat. Submarines threatened shipping. Poison gas spread fear and agony. Science was helping in the darkest possible way. At home, society strained. Women entered factories in huge numbers. Food shortages spread. Governments censored news. Debt mounted. Inflation grew. The old social order weakened under pressure.
And still, leaders insisted victory was near. Year after year.
In Russia, war stress helped trigger the Russian Revolution. Tsar Nicholas II fell. Later, the Bolsheviks seized power under Vladimir Lenin. One empire collapsed entirely. Another future conflict was already being born. Then, in 1917, unrestricted submarine warfare and other factors drew the United States into the war. Fresh manpower, industry, loans, and morale shifted the balance. Germany launched one last major offensive in 1918. It failed. Allied counterattacks followed. Germany's allies collapsed. German society cracked. Armistice came on November 11th, 1918. The guns stopped. The damage did not. Millions dead, millions wounded. Empires gone. German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, Russian. Economies shattered. Populations traumatized. A generation altered. And many people swore such a war must never happen again. A noble thought, poorly implemented, because the peace that followed would carry resentment, confusion, economic strain, and unfinished anger. And from that wreckage, the path to World War II would emerge. Slowly, then suddenly.
All right, settle in again. The guns of World War I fell silent in November 1918, and much of the world expected relief, healing, and perhaps a wiser future. Reasonable hopes. What followed was more complicated, because ending a war is not the same thing as building peace, especially after millions of deaths, ruined economies, collapsed empires, radical politics, epidemics, bitterness, and leaders who still believed they were the smartest people in every room. A hazardous combination. In 1919, diplomats gathered at the Palace of Versailles for the peace conference. The most prominent figures were Woodrow Wilson, David Lloyd George, and Georges Clemenceau. Wilson spoke of self-determination, open diplomacy, and a better international order. Clemenceau wanted security for France after repeated German invasions. Very understandable. Lloyd George balanced domestic politics, imperial interests, and practical concerns. Also understandable. Everyone arrived with principles and lists. The result was the Treaty of Versailles. Germany lost territory. Its army was severely restricted. It lost colonies. It accepted war guilt clauses. And it faced reparations payments. Now, historians debate details and later modifications, but emotionally and politically, the treaty became deeply unpopular in Germany. Many Germans felt humiliated. Many believed they had been stabbed in the back by politicians rather than defeated militarily. Falsehoods can be politically useful long after facts grow tired. Germany also became the Weimar Republic. This new democracy inherited war defeat, debt, revolution scares, paramilitary violence, and contempt from both extremes. A difficult first assignment. It was like handing someone a burning building and saying, "Please improve morale." Meanwhile, the map of Europe was redrawn. New or revived states emerged: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and others. Empires were broken apart. This answered some national aspirations. It also created minorities stranded inside new borders, disputed frontiers, and fresh resentments. The old problems had been rearranged, not eliminated.
Then there was the League of Nations, a noble attempt at collective security. Talk first, cooperate, prevent war. Excellent ideas. Unfortunately, the League lacked key powers, enforcement strength, and consistent commitment. The United States never joined, despite Wilson championing it, which was not ideal. Building a fire brigade and then declining membership has limitations. Now, let's glide into the 1920s. Parts of Europe experienced cultural vibrancy. Jazz spread, cinema expanded, fashion changed, cities danced, writers experimented. People wanted to forget trenches. Perfectly fair.
But underneath the glamour, political instability remained. Germany faced hyperinflation in 1923. Savings vanished. Middle-class security evaporated. People carried money in baskets. Some were paid twice daily so wages could be spent before prices rose again. Economic trauma leaves marks that spreadsheets rarely capture. Though later stabilization brought recovery, memory of chaos lingered. Elsewhere, Italy had already moved first into dictatorship. In 1922, Benito Mussolini came to power. He promised order, strength, national revival, efficiency, discipline. These are classic sales terms. Reality included repression, propaganda, vanity projects, and theatrical posing. He was very committed to being photographed dramatically. Then came the figure who would dominate Europe's darkest chapter, Adolf Hitler. A failed artist, veteran of World War I, gifted speaker, obsessive nationalist, conspiratorial thinker, and master manipulator of grievance. He joined a fringe political movement that became the Nazi Party. At first, many dismissed him. History repeatedly warns against underestimating loud extremists with organizational discipline. People rarely listen in time. Hitler attempted a failed coup in 1923. He went to prison. There, he dictated Mein Kampf, outlining racist ideology, expansionism, anti-Semitism, dictatorship, and revenge politics. Many ignored it. When someone writes down dangerous intentions clearly, it is usually worth reading carefully. Then the world economy crashed. The Great Depression began in 1929. Banks failed, trade shrank, unemployment soared. Democracies looked weak. Desperate voters sought certainty. Extremists offered simple answers to complex pain. Always suspiciously simple.
In Germany, unemployment and political paralysis helped the Nazis rise rapidly. Conservative elites believed they could use Hitler for their own purposes. A famous last thought. In 1933, Hitler became chancellor. Soon he dismantled democracy, crushed opposition, censored media, built a police state, and fused party with state. All very quickly. Institutions often look sturdy until tested. He also launched relentless propaganda. Mass rallies, symbols, myths, scapegoats, promises of restored pride, and systematic persecution of Jews, political enemies, disabled people, and others targeted by Nazi ideology. Hatred became policy, bureaucratically organized hatred, which is among the coldest forms. Meanwhile, Japan expanded militarily in Asia. Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League protested weekly. Aggressors noticed. The lesson seemed clear. Take risks. The world may complain, then adjust. Hitler remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936. Little resistance. He annexed Austria in 1938. Again, limited resistance.
then demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. At the Munich Agreement, Britain and France conceded territory in hopes of preserving peace. Peace for our time, said Neville Chamberlain. A tragic phrase.
Because Hitler interpreted concessions not as satisfaction, but weakness. Common predator logic. In March 1939, Germany seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. The mask of limited demands slipped. Then came Poland. Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, secretly dividing spheres of influence. Cynicism was fully employed. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. Again. Only this time, with tanks, aircraft, radios, totalitarian regimes, genocidal ideology, and lessons from the last war only half learned, which can be worse than learning none at all. All right, settle in once more. We now enter the early years of World War II, when events moved with terrifying speed, and many people realized too late that the old rules no longer applied. The First War had bogged down in trenches. This one began with motion. Fast columns, aircraft overhead, radio coordination, mechanized shock. The German method became known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. A dramatic name, sadly accurate. In September 1939, Poland was attacked from the west by Germany. Soon after, the Soviet Union invaded from the east under secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Poland fought bravely. It was overwhelmed. Its people then faced occupation by two brutal powers, a dreadful beginning. In the West, there followed the so-called phony war. Britain and France were officially at war with Germany, yet for months there was limited major action. Troops waited. Civilians wondered. Newspapers speculated. Governments prepared. Some hoped negotiation might still appear and rescue everyone from reality. It did not. In April 1940, Germany struck north. Denmark fell quickly. Norway was invaded. Control of Scandinavian routes and resources mattered strategically. Also, bold action kept opponents off balance. Then came May 1940, and Europe lurched. Germany attacked Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, drawing Allied attention north. Meanwhile, German armored forces drove through the Ardennes forest, terrain many considered difficult for tanks. History enjoys punishing assumptions. The Allied line fractured. Speed, confusion, and air power magnified the shock. Then came the evacuation at Dunkirk. Hundreds of thousands of British and Allied troops were trapped near the French coast. Military disaster seemed near. Instead, through naval effort, civilian boats, luck, courage, and German pauses, still debated by historians, large numbers escaped across the Channel. Britain lost equipment, but preserved manpower. Sometimes survival itself becomes victory. France soon collapsed. Paris was declared an open city. German troops entered in June 1940. The speed stunned the world. The nation that had once dominated Europe, then endured the First World War, now fell in weeks, a humiliation heavy with memory. Marshal Philippe Pétain led the collaborationist Vichy France. Meanwhile, Charles de Gaulle broadcast from London, urging continued resistance. Thus, France split between submission, survival, collaboration, resistance, and moral ambiguity. Occupied societies often become complicated very quickly. Now, Britain stood largely alone in Western Europe. Prime Minister Winston Churchill refused negotiation. He understood that peace on Hitler's terms would not be peace. It would be managed surrender. So Britain prepared, and Germany prepared to break it. The Battle of Britain began. German aircraft targeted airfields, radar stations, industry, then cities. The Royal Air Force resisted fiercely. Radar, pilot skill, industrial recovery, and strategic mistakes by Germany all mattered. Britain held. No invasion came. This was one of the war's first major turning points. Hitler had been checked. Then, the Blitz. London and other cities endured repeated bombing. Families sheltered underground. Children were evacuated. Firefighters worked through nights of flame. Ordinary endurance became strategic importance. War often depends on civilians more than speeches admit.
Meanwhile, Nazi control deepened across Europe. Occupation governments extracted labor and resources. Resistance networks formed. Secret presses printed leaflets. Sabotage grew. Informers prospered. Fear spread. So did courage, often quietly. And within occupied territories, Nazi racial policy escalated. Jews were stripped of rights, property, movement, safety, and humanity in official eyes. Ghettos were established in places like Warsaw. Violence intensified. What would become the Holocaust was unfolding through stages of exclusion, theft, deportation, and murder. Genocide rarely begins with gas chambers. It begins with language, law, bureaucracy, and indifference. Now to the Mediterranean. Benito Mussolini entered the war hoping for easy gains. He imagined quick glory. He often imagined things. Italian campaigns in Greece and North Africa struggled badly, forcing German intervention. Thus, Hitler acquired extra fronts because an ally kept tripping over furniture. In North Africa, battles swung across desert landscapes. Tanks maneuvered through vast open spaces. Supply lines mattered enormously. The famous Erwin Rommel gained reputation there, though logistics remained the real dictator of desert war.
Fuel decides many glamorous stories. Then came the greatest gamble of all. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union through Operation Barbarossa. He sought rapid victory, land, resources, and ideological conquest. He expected collapse. He often expected collapse. At first, German advances were enormous. Millions of Soviet troops were captured, cities encircled, territory overrun. But distance, resistance, mud, winter, and Soviet industrial resilience intervened. Russia has a long tradition of being larger than invaders prefer. By late 1941, German forces neared Moscow, but failed to finish the campaign. The Quick War had become a vast attritional struggle. Another turning point. And in December 1941, after attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan, the United States entered the war fully. Now Germany faced Britain, the Soviet Union, and American industrial power. A mathematically unhelpful development. The darkest years had not yet ended, but the axis of the war was shifting. Hitler had won much, perhaps too much, because conquest expands maps faster than it solves problems. All right, settle in again. We now reach the middle years of World War II, when the Axis powers still held enormous territory, yet the tide had begun to turn. Not suddenly, not neatly. History rarely offers clean pivots. Instead, there came grinding shifts of industry, manpower, logistics, morale, and mistakes accumulating interest. Let us begin on the Eastern Front, where scale itself became a weapon. After failing to take Moscow in 1941, Adolf Hitler launched a new campaign in 1942 towards southern Soviet territory. He wanted oil from the Caucasus. He wanted the Volga river routes. He wanted symbolic triumph. He wanted many things simultaneously. This often complicated planning. One city became the focal point, Stalingrad. Named for Joseph Stalin, industrially important, strategically placed, and politically impossible to abandon. The battle that followed became one of the most brutal in modern history. Street by street, room by room, factory by factory, ruins turned into fortresses. Winter added commentary. German forces entered much of the city, but Soviet defenders clung to riverbanks and shattered buildings. Then, in November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, striking weaker Axis forces on the flanks. The German Sixth Army was encircled.
A nightmare. Hitler forbade breakout. Supply by air was promised. Supply by air failed. Because physics can be rude to ideology. By February 1943, the trapped German forces surrendered. The defeat shattered the myth of German invincibility. It also signaled something larger. Germany could be beaten, and beaten decisively. Now glide westward. While armies clashed in Europe, another contest was unfolding in factories. The United States became what many called the arsenal of democracy. Shipyards launched vessels at astonishing speed. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines. Tanks, trucks, ammunition, engines, food, uniforms, medicine. Mass production surged. American industry, protected by oceans and fueled by resources, became a strategic force almost impossible to match. Sometimes the decisive battlefield is a factory floor. Women entered industrial labor in huge numbers. Families rationed goods. War bonds were sold. Scientists, engineers, welders, machinists, farmers, clerks, all became part of victory systems. War expands the meaning of soldier. Britain continued bombing campaigns against Germany. German cities endured devastation. Civilian suffering widened everywhere. Modern war had erased clean boundaries between front and home, if there ever had been any. In North Africa, Axis and Allied forces continued their long desert struggle. At Second Battle of El Alamein, British-led forces under Bernard Montgomery defeated Axis armies. Churchill famously said it was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning.
A rare speech line that aged well. Then, American and British forces landed in North Africa through Operation Torch. Axis forces there were gradually squeezed and defeated in 1943. The Mediterranean opened further. Italy looked vulnerable. And Italy was vulnerable. In July 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. Soon, Benito Mussolini was overthrown by his own regime. One risk of authoritarian systems is that loyalty can evaporate quickly once defeat arrives. Italy switched sides later, though German forces occupied much of the country, and fighting continued bitterly.
Mussolini would return briefly as a puppet ruler in the north, a diminished encore no one needed. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan faced growing pressure after key setbacks such as Battle of Midway and grinding island campaigns. Carrier warfare, code breaking, submarines, and industrial replacement rates mattered enormously. Again, factories and mathematics entered the chat. Back in occupied Europe, resistance movements grew stronger. Rail lines sabotaged, intelligence gathered, escaped airmen hidden. Underground newspapers spread hope. Partisans fought in forests and mountains. The risks were immense. So were reprisals. Yet occupation never became total obedience. At the same time, the Holocaust intensified. Mass shootings had already murdered vast numbers in Eastern Europe. Now extermination camps, such as Auschwitz concentration camp, Treblinka extermination camp, and others operated as industrialized murder systems. Railways carried victims.
Officials filed forms. Guards followed schedules. The administrative face of evil can look disturbingly ordinary. Millions of Jews were murdered, along with Roma people, disabled people, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, and many others. This remains central to understanding the war, not a side story, the story. By 1943, Germany still fought fiercely. Its armies remained dangerous. Its technology was formidable. Its control over much of Europe persisted. But the strategic picture had changed. The Soviet Union was pushing west. Britain endured. America was fully mobilized. Italy was collapsing. The skies over Germany grew contested. Resources tightened. Experienced troops were lost faster than replaced. And Hitler's interference in military decisions worsened. Confidence plus denial is a costly blend. Then came the question everyone knew was coming. When would the Western Allies return to France? The answer required ships, deception, training, weather, timing, and immense courage.
It would come in 1944, on beaches with names the world would remember. And from there, the Third Reich would begin to crumble in plain sight. All right, settle in one more time. We now reach the final phase of World War II in Europe, where defeat for Nazi Germany became increasingly likely, though no less destructive. Because collapsing regimes often become more dangerous, not less, and wars rarely end politely. By 1944, the Allies had superiority in production, growing air dominance, and experience from campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and the Atlantic. The Soviet Union was advancing from the east. Germany now faced enemies on multiple fronts, exactly the scenario earlier strategists had dreaded. Yet the Nazi regime fought on. The long-awaited invasion of Western Europe came on June 6, 1944. D-Day. Thousands of ships, airborne landings, massive deception plans, weather anxieties, young soldiers trying to appear calm while absolutely not feeling calm. The beaches of Normandy became the gateway back into occupied France. The landing zones, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword, each carried different struggles. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced especially fierce resistance. Many were killed before reaching cover. Confusion reigned. Plans unraveled. Small acts of leadership mattered enormously, as they often do when large plans meet machine gun fire. Yet the landings held. Reinforcements poured in. Ports were built artificially. Supplies followed.
Germany failed to throw the Allies back into the sea. A second major land front in Western Europe was now real and permanent. Meanwhile, in the east, Soviet offensives smashed German armies with staggering force. The Red Army had learned through terrible experience. It now combined manpower, artillery, armor, and operational skill on a massive scale. The cost remained horrific, but momentum belonged to Moscow. Inside Germany, daily life deteriorated. Bombing intensified. Fuel shortages worsened. Cities burned. Young boys and old men were increasingly called to defend the Reich. Propaganda still promised miracle weapons and final victory. Reality offered rubble. Not everyone inside Germany supported Hitler by this stage. Some never had. Others turned only when defeat became obvious. In July 1944, officers attempted the 20 July plot. A bomb exploded at Hitler's headquarters. He survived. Barely. The plot failed. Reprisals were savage. Dictatorships are notoriously poor sports. Paris was liberated in August 1944. Crowds celebrated. Occupation ended. Charles de Gaulle re-emerged prominently.
For many Europeans, liberation brought joy, mixed with grief, shortages, score settling, and the painful question of who had resisted, collaborated, or simply survived. Moral clarity is easier in speeches than in occupied neighborhoods. Germany still resisted fiercely. In December 1944, Hitler launched the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes. A surprise attack, temporary gains, heavy casualties, no strategic salvation. Germany lacked fuel, reserves, and time. 3 things war tends to require. Then, 1945 arrived. Allied armies crossed into Germany from west and east. Refugees flooded roads. Camps were discovered. The world confronted evidence of Nazi crimes in full scale. Starvation, forced labor, mass murder, medical atrocities, industrialized death. Words struggle here. They still do. The Holocaust's horrors were not battlefield excesses. They were policy. Designed, administered, expanded, carried out by institutions, officials, guards, collaborators, and willing participants. Remembering this matters because it reveals how modern systems can be bent toward monstrous ends. As Soviet forces closed on Berlin, Hitler retreated underground into the Führer bunker. He issued fantasies as armies collapsed. Imaginary divisions were ordered to attack. Maps were consulted as if paper might reverse artillery. Reality remained unmoved.
On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in the bunker. Soon after, Berlin fell. Germany surrendered in May 1945. In Europe, the war ended. Celebrations erupted. So did mourning. Millions had no homes to return to. Many had no families left. But globally, the war continued against Japan until August 1945, after devastating final campaigns and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. Tens of millions dead, cities ruined, economies shattered, empires weakened, borders altered, trauma everywhere. And yet from the wreckage came new institutions,
new technologies, decolonization movements, human rights language, and attempts, imperfect, always imperfect, to prevent repetition. Europe would rebuild. Germany would divide. The United States and Soviet Union would enter the Cold War. The 20th century still had many storms left, but the age of Hitler had ended in a bunker beneath a ruined capital, an empire of terror reduced to concrete walls and delusion. History can be slow, then sudden, and very final.
On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died in the bunker. Soon after, Berlin fell. Germany surrendered in May 1945. In Europe, the war ended. Celebrations erupted. So did mourning. Millions had no homes to return to. Many had no families left. But globally, the war continued against Japan until August 1945, after devastating final campaigns and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, along with Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. Tens of millions dead, cities ruined, economies shattered, empires weakened, borders altered, trauma everywhere. And yet from the wreckage came new institutions, new technologies, decolonization movements, human rights language, and attempts, imperfect, always imperfect, to prevent repetition. Europe would rebuild. Germany would divide. The United States and Soviet Union would enter the Cold War. The 20th century still had many storms left, but the age of Hitler had ended in a bunker beneath a ruined capital, an empire of terror reduced to concrete walls and delusion. History can be slow, then sudden, and very final.
All right, settle in again. The guns of World War II had finally gone silent in 1945. But silence did not mean peace in the emotional sense. It meant exhaustion. It meant rebuilding. It meant counting losses people didn't really have the language to describe. And it meant something else, too. A new kind of global tension was already forming in the background, like weather changing before the storm is visible. Europe in 1945 looked less like a continent and more like a repair project. Cities such as Berlin lay in ruins. France was liberated but damaged. United Kingdom had survived but was financially weakened. Soviet Union had suffered enormous destruction but emerged militarily dominant in Eastern Europe. And Germany itself was gone as a unified state, for now. The Allied powers divided defeated Germany into occupation zones. Eventually, this became the split between West and East Germany. One aligned with the Western democracies, one aligned with the Soviet system. A single nation split into two ideological experiments. A map decision that would shape decades. Meanwhile, something new was happening globally. Two powers now stood above all others, the United States and the Soviet Union. One capitalist, one communist. One democratic, one authoritarian. Both heavily armed. Both suspicious. Both convinced they were fundamentally right. A balanced situation in the worst possible way.
This period became known as the Cold War. Not a single declared war between the superpowers, but a long global competition involving alliances, intelligence agencies, nuclear weapons, propaganda, and proxy conflicts. War
without the traditional name, which somehow made it more complicated, not less. The United States, strengthened by wartime production, emerged as an economic giant. Cities expanded, consumer culture grew, universities and research institutions flourished, technology accelerated. And internationally, the U.S. shaped institutions like the United Nations and the Marshall Plan. Rebuilding Europe became both humanitarian and strategic policy. The Marshall Plan helped Western Europe recover economically. Factories reopened, infrastructure was rebuilt, trade resumed. Living standards slowly improved. It wasn't instant, but it worked, and it helped stabilize democracies in Western Europe. On the other side, the Soviet Union consolidated control over Eastern Europe. Countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and others became part of the Soviet sphere. Governments aligned with Moscow. Opposition was often suppressed. A political and military buffer zone was created, and Europe was now clearly divided. This division was symbolized physically by the Iron Curtain, a term popularized by Winston Churchill. It wasn't a literal curtain, but it might as well have been. Movement between East and West became restricted. Information became filtered. Suspicion became routine. Then came the nuclear age. The United States developed atomic weapons during the war. The Soviet Union developed them shortly after. Now both sides had the ability to destroy entire cities. And this created something new in human history: mutual fear on a planetary scale. Deterrence became strategy. Peace became unstable, but necessary. The world also saw rapid decolonization. European empires weakened after the war. India gained independence in 1947. Countries across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East followed over the coming decades. Old imperial systems gave way to new national identities, and sometimes new conflicts. History rarely leaves a vacuum empty. Europe itself began rebuilding faster than many expected. By the 1950s, Western Europe experienced economic growth. Industries modernized, cities were reconstructed, living standards improved, and cooperation slowly increased among former rivals. This eventually led toward European integration efforts. Meanwhile, Cold War tensions continued. There were crises, espionage, proxy wars, ideological competition, and technological races. Space exploration became part of geopolitical rivalry. Education, science, sports, and culture were all subtly influenced by global competition. Even peace was competitive. Germany eventually became two countries: Federal Republic of Germany and German Democratic Republic. Berlin itself became divided, symbolically and physically. Families were separated, travel was restricted, and a wall would later define that division even more sharply. And yet, despite tension, Europe avoided direct superpower war. The Cold War remained cold in that sense, but it was not peaceful in many regions. Conflicts erupted in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and elsewhere, each shaped by superpower influence. Local wars became global chess pieces. Over time, nuclear deterrence created a strange stability. Neither side wanted total war, because total war now meant total destruction. So diplomacy, espionage, alliances, and careful signaling became central tools. A tense equilibrium. By the late 20th century, the Cold War began to weaken. Economic strain,
political reform movements, and internal pressures affected the Soviet system. Reforms under leaders like Mikhail Gorbachev introduced openness and restructuring. But reforms also destabilized control. In 1989, Eastern European countries began breaking away from Soviet influence. The fall of the Berlin Wall became a global symbol of change. People crossed freely.
Barriers were dismantled. The Cold War structure began collapsing. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War officially ended. A world order that had defined nearly half a century was suddenly gone. The United States remained the sole superpower for a time, but new global dynamics were already forming. And so the long arc from Napoleon's Europe through industrial revolutions, world wars, and ideological conflicts led to a modern world shaped by technology, globalization, and interdependence, but also shaped by memory. Because the 20th century did not fade quietly. It left archives and warnings. From Napoleon Bonaparte to nuclear diplomacy, from empires to superpowers, from horse cavalry to mechanized war to satellites, history didn't move in a straight line. It moved in shocks, in cycles, in ambitions that outran caution. And maybe that's the quiet ending lesson here. Not that history is doomed to repeat exactly, but that human systems, political, military, economic, can become powerful faster than they become wise. And when they do, the consequences tend to arrive slowly, then all at once.
All right, last stretch now. We're no longer in the age of empires or world wars in the same way, but the aftermath of everything you've just seen still hasn't fully ended. Because history doesn't neatly close chapters, it leaves them slightly open and lets the next generation argue about the footnotes. After the collapse of the Cold War structure, the world entered a phase often called the post-Cold War era. That phrase sounds calm. It wasn't. It just meant the main tension between two superpowers had ended, and now many smaller tensions could grow without that global restraint system. The United States remained the dominant military and economic power for a time. Its influence spread through trade, culture, technology, and global institutions. Internet infrastructure, finance systems, entertainment, and academic exchange increasingly centered around global connectivity. In short, the world got faster, smaller, and more interconnected. And also more complicated. The rise of the internet changed everything again. Information traveled instantly. Ideas spread globally in seconds. Economies became deeply linked. Cultural identity became both global and local at the same time. A person could live in one country, work for another, and be influenced by a third through a screen. Something entirely new in human history. But old problems didn't disappear. They evolved. Regional conflicts continued in different forms. Political tensions shifted rather than vanished. Economic inequality became a major global discussion point. And climate change emerged as a shared long-term challenge affecting every continent. Europe, once the center of global conflict, moved toward integration. The European Union expanded cooperation in trade, law, and movement. Borders became more open in many regions. Currencies were unified in some countries through the euro. It was an attempt to turn a history of conflict into a structure of cooperation. Still imperfect, but historically significant. Meanwhile, technological change accelerated. Artificial intelligence, biotechnology, renewable energy, space exploration, and digital communication reshape society. The world that once moved at the speed of horses, steam, and telegraphs
now operates at digital speed. A message can cross the planet instantly. A financial decision can ripple globally in seconds. A local event can become international news in minutes. And yet, even in this modern world, echoes remain. The consequences of the 20th century still shape borders, alliances, and political debates. The legacy of World War I and World War II still influences military strategy, international law, and global memory. Monuments stand. Museums preserve. Stories are retold. Because forgetting would be easier, but dangerous. New global powers have also emerged. Countries like China have grown economically and technologically, reshaping global trade and diplomacy. International relationships are now multipolar rather than strictly bipolar, meaning influence is shared among many major players rather than just one or two, which makes global coordination both more flexible and more complex. Migration, culture, and identity have also transformed. People move across continents for work, education, safety, and opportunity. Diasporas connect regions in ways previously impossible. A single city might contain dozens of languages, traditions, and histories living side by side.
A modern echo of the diversity once contained within empires, just structured differently. And underneath all of this modern complexity, there is still a quieter continuity. Human ambition, human fear, human creativity, human conflict. The same forces that shaped Napoleon's Europe, industrial revolutions, world wars, and the Cold War still exist. They just operate at a different speed now. If there's a thread connecting everything from the Napoleonic era to today, it might be this. Systems grow more powerful over time. Technology expands capability, but human decision-making remains imperfectly human. Sometimes brilliant, sometimes cautious, sometimes disastrously overconfident. And that brings us back, strangely enough, to where we started. Not a single moment, not a single leader, but a pattern. Empires rise, they expand, they collide, they collapse. New systems form. And the cycle continues, not exactly the same way each time, but with familiar rhythms underneath. So when people ask what really happened between Napoleon and the modern world, or between the world wars and today, the honest answer is everything changed, and nothing entirely disappeared. History didn't end. It just became more connected, more global, more fast-moving, and more aware of itself. And maybe that's the final quiet thought for this long journey. The past isn't gone. It's just reorganized into the present, and it keeps whispering. Through borders, institutions, technologies, and decisions that still shape tomorrow. All right, this is the final stretch. No more wars to march through. No more empires rising and collapsing in fast forward. Just a quiet look at what all of it actually leaves behind. Because once you zoom out far enough, history stops feeling like separate events and starts feeling like one long, continuous chain reaction that never fully cools down. The world after World War II didn't become simple. It became structured. More rules, more institutions, more diplomacy, more interconnected systems trying to prevent the kind of chaos that defined the early 20th century. And yet, tension never fully disappeared. It just changed form.
We built global organizations to manage conflict. We built economic systems to stabilize trade. We built alliances to deter war. We built communication networks to reduce misunderstanding. And all of it works, most of the time. But most of the time has never been the guarantee humanity is great at relying on. The legacy of figures like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill still shapes how governments think about power, risk, and leadership. Not because the world repeats them directly, but because it learned what happens when systems lose balance, and then spent decades trying, imperfectly, to avoid it happening again. Even today, military strategy, diplomacy, and international law are still deeply influenced by the outcomes of global conflicts like World War I and World War II.
Borders drawn in the aftermath still exist. Alliances formed during fear still persist. And memorials still remind people that these were not abstract events. They were lived experiences. Millions of them. But history is not only about destruction. It is also about adaptation. After every major global disruption, societies rebuild in ways that reflect what they've learned, or think they've learned. Sometimes wisely. Sometimes with overconfidence. And sometimes just differently enough to postpone the next crisis rather than prevent it. Technology is one of the biggest changes. From steam engines to nuclear power, from telegraphs to the internet, from mass printing to global digital media. Each leap compresses time and distance, and each one makes human decisions travel faster than ever before, which is powerful and slightly nerve-wracking, depending on how you think about it. The modern global system is now deeply interconnected. Trade routes span continents. Supply chains cross oceans. Financial markets respond instantly to events anywhere. A decision in one capital can ripple across the planet within hours. That level of connection has no real historical equivalent. Not even close. And yet, despite all this complexity, the core patterns remain surprisingly familiar. Competition for resources, struggles over power, shifting alliances, ideological disagreements,
And periodic moments where everything feels stable, right before it suddenly doesn't. One of the most interesting things about studying long arcs of history is realizing this. People in every era believed they were at the end of history, that things had finally stabilized, that the system they were living in would last. And then something shifted, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly, but always eventually. The modern world is not an exception to history. It is just a continuation of it, at higher speed and more visibility. We see more, we know more, we react faster. But we are still working with the same fundamental human instincts that existed centuries ago. So when we look back from Napoleon's time, through industrial revolutions, through world wars, through Cold War tensions, and into today, what we're really seeing is not a straight line of progress or decline. It's a layered system of experiments, some successful, some catastrophic, some still unresolved. And maybe that's the most honest conclusion. History is not a finished story. It's an ongoing negotiation between what humans want, what they fear, and what they are capable of building under pressure. Sometimes it produces incredible cooperation. Sometimes it produces unimaginable destruction. Often, both within the same century. So, if there's a final takeaway from this long journey through global conflict, empires, revolutions, and modern transformation, it might be this: the world doesn't move forward because it becomes perfect. It moves forward because it keeps rebuilding after mistakes. Again and again and again. And as long as people continue to remember that balance between ambition and consequence, between power and restraint, there is at least a chance that the next chapters won't repeat the worst parts of the last ones. Not guaranteed, just possible. And in history, possibility is often the only thing standing between stability and change. All right? That's where we'll leave it. Not at an ending, but at a pause. Because history never really stops. It just keeps moving forward, quietly, even when nobody is looking.